Hi folks, welcome back to Center for Lit. Adam Andrews here with a few words on teaching literature classically at the rhetoric level. In previous videos, I've talked about how we use the terms grammar level, logic level, and rhetoric level in classical education in a couple of different senses. And I want to continue to focus on a particular sense of these terms, and that is the description of stages of student development, stages of the development of the mind and heart as the student ages and matures. And whereas in the grammar level, a student is generally most interested in identifying, memorizing, and categorizing details of, say, a work of literature. And in the logic level, he's more interested in seeing how these details connect with one another and understanding the relationships of cause and effect. At the rhetoric level, he takes these details and their relationships and uses them to express an interpretation of a work of literature. And this idea of interpretation has some implications. Not only does he express his own understanding of a work of literature and his own grasp of what the author was trying to say, but also he sees the relationship of that thematic statement with other things that are being said in the world of literature, not only in his own day, but also in his past. And he enters, as it were, into a conversation himself as a participant, using the work of literature that he has studied as a jumping off point. And this is kind of the capstone or the goal of literary education, is to help students achieve this level of understanding and maturity in their reading and in their interpretation of literature so that they can participate in a great conversation. So how do we do that? What are the techniques and the approaches that we take? Well, it's interesting to remember what we were trying to do in the logic stage, because it provides a good jumping off point for what we do in the rhetoric stage. Remember, at the logic stage, we've asked the students to understand the connections between the parts of a story and understand all of these things as a group, the connection between these things and the author's theme, right? At the very beginning, the logic stage is the very beginning of thematic analysis. And we also ask logic stage students to start thinking about how the author's theme in this book relates to his worldview generally, as expressed in other books, or as an outgrowth of his own experiences as an individual in the life and times of the author. At the rhetoric stage, we continue this process by asking, how does the thematic statement that an author is making in this story relate to other thematic statements made by other authors at other times and places? And the skill that the student is developing at this stage in expressing his own interpretations of a story bleeds over into understanding connections or relations or similarities or differences between his interpretation of story A and his interpretation of other stories by other authors from other eras of the world. We ask students particular questions in this connection that have to do with this kind of habit of mind, which they are, if they've done their work in the grammar stage and the logic stage well, they're prepared for this kind of thinking and indeed this kind of writing and discussing when they get into the higher grades in high school. So questions like this: do other authors make similar statements about this issue? Similar statements to the ones that authors are making in the book under discussion. Does this issue appear in works across the ages? Is there a dialogue that can be participated in with respect to the issue that is thematically important in this book? Homer's Iliad is, among other things, about bitterness and resolution that comes from laying bitterness down. Is that the kind of thing that authors have addressed over the centuries since Homer? And is that issue on the table here in the book we're talking about today? If so, does today's author respond in some way to what Homer said about bitterness and resolution? Can these two authors be seen to be engaging in a dialogue across the centuries? In fact, this idea of dialogue is really important at the rhetoric level. As a student is developing his own techniques and his own powers of interpretation, I actually think the author of Huckleberry Finn was saying a particular thing in response to the currents swirling all around him. This idea of dialogue becomes very important. The student himself is engaging in a dialogue with the work, and he notices that the author of the work is engaging in a dialogue too. In fact, we use this term to describe one of the main goals of the rhetoric stage of classical lit teaching. We use the term biblioscopic dialogue to describe this process of taking the shape of a conversation around a particular idea and seeing how various authors across history have engaged in that conversation. Various contributions made at points in history in the works of particular authors. A student who takes the shape of the biblioscopic dialogue is participating himself in that great conversation. And even though he may not have something original to say at age 18 or age 16 or whatever it is, that the experience of noticing that there's a conversation going on and that Stephen Crane in The Red Badge of Courage is not writing in a vacuum, but is responding to what came before, and that works that came after him may be responding to Red Badge of Courage and responding to Stephen Crane. It gives the student a sense of being involved in a history-long sweep of conversation. Techniques that we use to get students aware, to make them aware of this conversation and of their place in a history-long sweep, are appropriate to the rhetoric level of teaching literature classically. I should just say here in closing that it's important that we lay the foundation of the grammar level and the logic level before we really get into rhetoric. And you can see that that's important, right? In order to understand the themes of an author, we have to go back and understand how the pieces of his story fit together. And in order to understand how the pieces of his story fit together, we have to be able to identify them. We have to be able to distinguish them and put them in the right buckets. Once this foundation is laid, however, the student is prepared to address questions like, who else is saying this about the world? And how does the contributions of this author compare with contributions of other authors before and since? When students are doing this, they're participating in biblioscopic dialogue, and they are getting the most out of the rhetoric level of classical literature. I hope this has been informative and encouraging. If so, be sure to like and subscribe, and we will be with you again soon with another video. Thanks for watching.